Okay. Thank you very much, Lee. Good morning, everyone. Let me be the second person to kind of publicly wish you a happy new year. This morning's session is aimed at hopefully allowing us to dip our toe, and that's all it is at this stage. Dip our toe into three potential techniques that I genuinely believe will increase our ability to teach our students to think, and to think at a higher order. And there's something ever so slightly ironic about this morning's session clashing on the same day as a QRD process. Because what BTEC delivery became in some examples and in some areas, and what it mutated into, was the exact opposite of the kind of teaching and learning and the kind of sparking of curiosity in our students, and coaching students in asking deep and pertinent and searching questions. The kind of focus of this morning's session. What BTEC delivery became was the absolute opposite of that kind of philosophy on teaching and learning. So there's something quite ironic that these two things are going to happen on the same day. It's essentially designed, as I say, we'll all be at different stages in these three techniques. There will be some of us that, when I'm going through one particular one, will glaze over because that element of practice is so well embedded in their own teaching and learning that what I'm going to ask in that example is that you support those around the table that aren't. And then there might be the other two might be a technique that you may not be as familiar with. So we're all going to be at different starting points in embedding this type of approach and thinking about learning in this way. But I hope across the three, there will be, hopefully, everyone will be able to move on to the next step in embedding this type of thinking and these approaches to learning through the course of this session. Now, the impetus, or if you like, the stimulus for that moving on and that moving to the next stage in the development of our teaching and learning, some of it will come from the content of this morning's session, but what I would expect is the vast majority of that to come from the discussion around the tables that you sat at now. And what I'll try and do periodically through the course of this morning's session, which I'm hoping will finish about 10:30, is to hand things over with a task just to get you discussing the kind of approach and the strategy that we've just looked at. Okay. Now, absolutely fundamental to the whole session, really, is an appreciation that there is a distinct difference between asking students to do more and asking students to do harder, or to think higher, or to question deeper. Those two things are incredibly different. And for me, that is a fundamental mindset that we need to appreciate before we continue with this session. It's not about volume of work, it's about the depth that we're asking students to go. And so it really forces us to question, what do we mean by progress? Is progress moving on to the next worksheet? Is progress thinking of 20 examples instead of 10? Or is progress asking students to identify something, then analyse what they've just identified? Or is progress asking students to understand something, but then evaluate its effectiveness? And so it really does hone in what we mean by progress. And please note that in the bulk of what we're going to refer to this morning, you will not see, you'll not see like loads of kind of level descriptors, or you'll not see BTEC assessment criteria grids, or you'll not see national curriculum level criteria. Because progress, that's progress. Progression through Bloom's taxonomy is progress. And actually, if you look at all of the things that I've just mentioned in terms of level descriptors, they pretty much all follow a very, very similar progression route through that taxonomy. And so when we say students are making progress within a lesson, that progress should be through that taxonomy and that hierarchy of thinking. as opposed to more or progressing onto the next task. The subsequent task needs to be more cognitively challenging than the prior one. What I did do, I asked for some examples from various colleagues of level descriptors, whether it be national curriculum level descriptors or whether it be the grade A descriptors from GCSE specifications, and I threw it into a couple of Wordles. And what the Wordles over my shoulder show is the frequency. The larger the word, the higher the frequency with which it appears in those descriptors. So the larger words appear, and this is in our levels 5 and 6 national curriculum level descriptors. And these are the kind of words that appear. I have a second to absorb them. And then when we move on to our grade A descriptors at GCSE, we have the same Wordle. So you'll see largest ones: relationships, critically, reasoned, judgments, interpret, analyse. There's probably no shocks there at all. So this morning's session really is aimed at trying to increase the frequency with which we ask students to cognitively demonstrate these thinking processes, and how effectively we teach and guide our students through these thought processes. Because it's becoming increasingly important, and when, you can imagine the countless conversations I've had with the current Mrs. Duffy over Christmas about this workshop. What am I trying to say here, Elaine? What am I trying to say here? What am I trying to say here? And we were talking about the importance of the cognitive process versus the answer. And do you know what, surprisingly, she drew my attention to was maths and the working out in maths. When I started maths GCSE, my working out went in the bin at the end of it. All my thought process, my cognitive process went in the bin because it wasn't important. I got me marks for whether I got it right or got it wrong. Whereas now, they get just as many marks for the working out as they do the actual answer, because the cognitive process that we're trying to coach our students in and train them in is as important as anything else. Why? Because it's a lifelong skill. They will leave us with cognitive processes just as much as they will leave us with a brown envelope full of certificates. So they should hold as equal weight as getting the answer right. I'm going to throw a couple of data slides in, and then we'll go into our first technique. We'll look at several kind of key assessment points throughout our organisation and try and draw some conclusions from that in terms of the need for us to teach students and coach students in higher order thinking more frequently. This first one is, if you like, our starting point, essentially, isn't it? At Key Stage 1, what you can see on the right-hand side of that graph is high, really good comparable rates in terms of students achieving a level 1 or above. Superb. And then you see the progression in reading, writing and maths cumulatively as we go up the higher grades. Now, it is worth noting at this stage that this is not a progress measure, it is an attainment measure. It is also worth taking into account that this graph fails to make any reference to the starting points of these students prior to their arrival, or the quality of their home life, or their coaching, or how many bedtime stories they've been read, or how much dining room table conversation they have, and the quality of their home lives and how that kind of affects the development in their first 5 years. None of that is taken into account. But what you can see is where we start to drop further below the national average is levels 2A and 3. So those higher levels of achievement are where our students are struggling to progress and struggling to meet national averages. When we start to look at Key Stage 2, we get these lovely graphs, don't we? These lovely ones where there's all zeros there, because every student made at least expected progress for Key Stages 1 and 2, and that's for reading, writing and maths. And we get these lovely graphs that said everyone's showing progress, everyone's making at least the expected progress. what this morning's session really is about is looking at how many students make better than expected progress. How do we break what a former colleague of mine used to call breaking the cognitive barrier? I can get them to understand it, Pete. I can even get them to write it when I provide them with a writing frame. But can I get them to evaluate it? They're easily thrown when the question's reworded. And all it needs is for the question to get a little bit, to get reworded, or for them to use an unfamiliar term, or to rephrase it, and it throws them. That's because we're teaching them understanding and answers, as opposed to thought processes and how to think. So, when we progress through to between key stages 2 and 4, what we have there is the progress, proportion of our level 4s making at least expected and then making better than expected. Now, the fact that these percentages are lower than those percentages will probably not come as an enormous surprise. A smaller proportion of students make better than expected progress than make expected progress. That's probably not a new one on us. But what should cause us some, not concern, but alarm, is the fact that these percentages of our level 5 students are lower than those percentages in all but one of those measures. It's only 2011 in maths, where our level 5s, or a higher proportion of our level 5s, made expected progress. So, fewer of our most able students make expected progress in those two subjects. Now that suggests a cognitive barrier. That suggests students whose functional skills on their arrival in our doors at the start of year 7 are well in place, because we're not talking about flaky 4s there. We're talking about level 5s, students who have come through primary school above the national expectation. And only 4 out of 10 are getting what they should get 5 years later. Quite compelling. That should be significantly higher than that. The level number of 5s, because those functional skills are well embedded and in place, they should more likely, and all nationally, a higher proportion of 5s make expected and better than expected progress. So there's something not quite right there. And then if you're thinking about, well, who are we talking about here? And as Lee said at the start, the profile of our year groups is shifting. And it's shifting probably quicker than I've ever seen in 12 years. The shift is significant, when you look at year 11 and year 7 and so on. But if we average all that out, on average, in our secondary phase, 6 out of 10 of our students come to us at national average, at least. 1 out of 10, currently, on average, comes to us above the national average. And then 3 out of the 10, on average, comes to us below. So these figures on students making expected and better than expected progress accounts for 7 out of 10 of our youngsters. A huge proportion. Who are failing at the minute in significant proportions or in appropriate proportions to achieve those higher levels of achievement. So what is expected progress for a 5? It's a grade B. So what that suggests is last year 71% got a grade C or below, having come to us with a level 5. So this morning's session is about teaching our students to think critically. It's about stimulating their curiosity. It's about coaching them in critical thought processes that they need in order to access those higher levels of achievement. Okay. And just in case it's a case of English and maths again, I completely concur. And we didn't actually kind of compare notes before this morning. It is every subject. Lee's absolutely right. More now than ever. Every subject, every student, students need to at least make expected progress, and swathes of students at various starting points are not. So, the first technique we're going to go through this morning is the flipped classroom. Now, the email that you've received this morning that says, "Good afternoon, everybody," I sent through over the break. So, obviously, my Outlook's not updated until I've come in this morning, docked on, and then you've got an email saying, "Good afternoon," this morning, at about 7:45 this morning. Anyone managed to watch it this morning? Full marks, right, okay. What I'm going to ask, I'll come and speak to those people in a moment and ask them to do something beyond what everybody else is doing and ask you to question this a little bit further. I'm not going to talk, instead of listening to me live, you're now going to listen to me on a 6-minute video. I do apologise for that. But this is an explanation of what the flipped classroom is all about.
Hello everybody, this is an attempt to introduce you to the concept of the flipped classroom. I'm going to demonstrate this by flipping a section of our seminar. As you can see from the graphic on the screen, the flipped classroom is a simple but effective inversion of the traditional teaching approach. Currently, a significant proportion of students' classroom time is spent absorbing curriculum content and then applying it. And the function of homework in this traditional approach then asks students to again apply that knowledge in another way, whether it be in a new case study or a new exam question, for example. In the flipped classroom, however, curriculum content is the homework, the lecture is the homework. All the snippets of curriculum content that the teacher intended to be absorbed in the classroom is packaged in as an engaging, user-friendly and accessible format for students to view, to reflect on and to question prior to the lesson. Now, if you're thinking, oh, how many times have I asked students to do preparatory reading or research before a lesson, and how many times have they failed to do so, then I pose 4 questions to you. The first one is, how did you structure the information? How did you package or present the information in terms of format and the kind of questioning within that information? Did you embrace and take full advantage of educational technology, the kind of educational technology that all of our students now have access to, both in our building and at home? What did you ask students to do with that information? Now, when we think about these things and take them into account fully, it can have a staggering impact on the proportion of students that access the material in between lessons. The concept of the flipped classroom came about when 2 American science teachers, Jonathan Bergman and Aaron Sand, decided to record their PowerPoint presentations and post them on the internet for absent students. These started to be viewed by students that had actually attended the lesson, and they were viewing them as a form of revision or revisiting concepts that they may not have understood first time around. So Bergman and Sam turned this on its head and posted the video before the lessons. The function then of the teacher and the classroom setting was completely revolutionised. The teacher became the coach, and the classroom became a lab, a place in which lines of inquiry were followed, skills were practiced and developed, and trial and error took place, and a place where students' questions were posed and sometimes answered. So how did they achieve this at Woodland Park High? As a starting point, each teacher created 3 videos a week between 5 and 7 minutes long. Access problems for students were identified and addressed from the very start in the form of an IT audit which was conducted in each class to identify who had access to what technology. And so a lunchtime viewing session was set up in the department. So they run this project for a term, and they found several benefits to the approach. It significantly changed the nature of the classroom activity. Time saved from lecturing, essentially, was spent developing students' skills, feeding back to students, answering students' questions, setting up inquiries and supporting students in them. And so the learning experience became a much more active, personalised and student-centred one, as opposed to listening to content at from the teacher. Now this narrative is very, very similar and almost identical to the conception of the Khan Academy. Salman Khan founded the Khan Academy. Salman Khan was a hedge fund analyst in New York, but before he took up that post and while he was still living in New Orleans, he would tutor his young cousin Nadia in mathematics. But Salman moved to New York just as his cousin was preparing for her finals. So he continued to tutor her by posting short video tutorials online. Well, very quickly, other friends and family began to view and use these videos, and their popularity exploded. Salman left the hedge fund profession and set up a non-profit making organisation called the Khan Academy, which now has over 2,500 video lessons in subjects ranging from mathematics to the humanities. And they've been viewed 334 million times by 1.5 million subscribers. Subscription is completely free. No advertisements and no anything else attached to that subscription. I wonder how many of those 1.5 million subscribers are our students. So in conclusion, the flipped classroom is a huge reminder to me of what learning really is, and equally as importantly, what learning is not. It reminds us that storytelling or lecturing is not teaching. Effective teaching is about sparking interest and curiosity. It's about coaching learners through cognitive processes that equip them for future learning. And the flipped classroom accelerates student progress towards higher order thinking and gets those students accessing higher order thinking much quicker than a traditional approach. So your task is to watch the tutorial again and bring with you any questions you may have of this technique. You can pause the video in this slide to help you formulate your questions and make them as deep as you possibly can. So I hope you enjoyed this flipped section of the seminar, and I look forward to seeing you and collaboratively pursuing answers to some of your questions. Thank you.
That was my telephone voice, by the way. It was as posh as I get, I'm afraid. It's on YouTube, so you want to try and be a bit posh if you're going on YouTube, don't you? Okay, that's the task. You've got a couple of bits of flip chart, and what I'm going to ask you to do is a SWOT analysis. 99.99% of us are very familiar with the SWOT analysis approach. Those of you who aren't, it's outlined in the booklet that supports the session. So, the flipped classroom, an inversion. Students absorb the content in between lessons. The classroom becomes a place where skills are developed as opposed to content is absorbed. Right, I want strengths, weaknesses, potential opportunities, and threats. But imagine the power if you'd already seen that. We'd just gained 6 minutes. 6 minutes of skill development, 6 minutes of coaching, 6 minutes of personal individualized feedback, 6 minutes of that gained simply by flipping that. Okay, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. There's a couple of flip charts on each table, so if you can have a couple on the go at any one time, that's fantastic. And we'll circulate and have a look at the content of those. 10 minutes, thank you. There should be. I got 100. Okay. Are there any spare booklets on here? Thank you. Oh, have you got one? Oh, thank you. Thank you. You got one there. Are there any spare booklets on this table? Thank you. So. Are there any surplus booklets on? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Any surplus booklets on here? No? Fine. Oh, you need to? Are there any spare booklets on this table now? To be in? Okay. Are there any spare booklets on this table? No? Sure? No, thank you. I've got it. Thank you, Brill. Any spare booklets on here?
I did the questions a bit creatively.
Okay.
I applied for them.
You applied that you
I
applied?
applied with full lot and free version.
Okay. Right, okay. Is he being troublesome?
No.
Yeah, that's fine. It's got nothing to do with the flipped classroom, but it's still good. Yeah, not bothered. It doesn't matter really. It's recorded on here, so it sounded good. As long as that picked it up rather than you, it doesn't matter, does it? Isn't that right? I put a handful of on which table were you at? Right at the back. Is there a spare booklet there? Can I have that one? Thank you, thank you. Thanks. You don't necessarily need it for the session, Di, so if that's all right. Morning. Jane. I'd say for me, we've also, how many times have we asked students to do preparatory reading between a session and they've not done it? Well, my question is, what are they more likely to do?
Yeah,
That's it for me. And so there's kind of logistical and kind of operational things like naming the video. So I made the mistake of doing a trial on Andreas Vesalius, but it just called me video, Andreas Vesalius. So you type in Andreas Vesalius and 14,000 come up before mine. Whereas you've got Andreas Vesalius, BSCA, it comes straight to the top. So that is the flipped classroom demo, BSCA. You type that in, comes up. So in terms of using YouTube, so little things like what you name your video can be operational. It's about how accessible, genuinely accessible. So I'm over here in a conversation about, oh well, they never write their own work down. How can you make them listen to it? It's not about making them listen to it. It's about making it as engaging to the point where they might just want to. Imagine.
Introducing it, and you see how much to find that. I want to read that, or just look at this and then come to the classroom, apply the knowledge,
Yeah.
what the content is.
And how many times don't they?
Well,
You know, in between, you know, the frequency with which they don't do that is quite staggering, isn't it? But the question is, what are they more likely to access in between a lesson? A research paper, a section of the textbook, or something like that? That's the question.